All right, guys, we're back for technique tips number 4. This one, we're going to cover stones and, in the greater context, the basics of doing extensions with any implement, because it's all kind of the same. Appreciate you guys sticking around to do the first 3. These are really fun to make. It's a lot of sweating, heavy breathing, and muffled audio while I try to explain things. But I think you guys are getting something out of it. So when we're covering the stones, there's a couple things we're going to go over. Is how to take your grip, your position off the floor, your position in the lap, and then probably what's the most important is the basics of an extension, because I think most people do that poorly. There are kind of 2 styles of extension, but I very heavily favor the second one. So let's get into the grip, which I'll pull a shot in a little bit tighter so you can see what I'm doing. With a stone, I think a lot of people early on go straight to tacky, and in some sense, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot. A lot of the best stone lifters in the world very famously do long periods of training without tacky. Trey Mitchell, Mitch Hooper does most of his training, it appears, without tacky and chalk on some very smooth stones. Absolute crazy behavior, but what that does is it allows you to build up the specific strength to do this squeeze properly. If you go to heavy tacky early on, you're probably going to miss some of the fundamentals, and then eventually when you get to really heavy stones or your tacky fails in a show, you're just screwed. You have no fundamentals to go back on and no specific strength to go back on. So I would suggest early on doing a lot of maybe chalk only stone training or very light tack on the fingers or maybe just spray tack. The positions that I'm going to describe here, I didn't really figure out in any kind of complex or comprehensive way until I spent some time without tacky and was forced to learn properly. So what I try to do is I split down the middle of the stone, okay? I set my hands, okay? And then basically, if I was to pull the slack out of a deadlift, like my hands are fixed to a bar, if I had my arms bent and I was gonna pull the slack out of a deadlift, my arms would come together. And that's kind of how I think about how I get grip with the forearms. I'm trying to get as much surface area of the forearms in contact with the stone. So I set the hands with a little bit bent arms, okay? And then when I pulled slack, quote unquote, out of the deadlift, it encourages my arms to come straight, okay? So now I'm not pulling in the biceps, I'm more through the lats and the mid-back squeezing together. And if my hands are set properly, now I have a lot of force of my forearms pushing in. And you'll see the skin of my forearm sets on the stone. And then when I do that pulling slack motion, the skin pulls kind of taut, right? It's kind of like when you pull the calluses pre-taut on you when you do farmers, right? So I set my hands, set my forearms, and then I pull that slack, and that just created a lot of grip here in the forearms. Gets a lot of pressure from the lat squeezing in. So position off the floor. It's gonna be a little different for everybody's leverages. You gotta remember, I'm 6 foot, 350, kind of fat, long torso, short limbs. So my positions are gonna be different than Thor or somebody who's 6'6", all limbs, or a little 64 kilo girl that's 5'2", right? But I think the basics are all kind of the same. So I line up toes about the middle of the stone on a really big stone, maybe even a little back from the middle, just because it's so large. My width is just wide enough that I can fit my arms down to do what they need to do. So I'm not going out super wide, okay? And how I get into position, I think of it like I'm doing kind of a stiff leg deadlift as far as that's how I get my tension. So I go down, I go hips back to load the hips and the hamstrings. My arms are going straight down the middle of the stone, and I will squat that last little bit to get my arms deep. And I'm gonna need to get especially deep as the stones get big, so I get more surface area of the forearms on the stone. When I get up to like a 22-inch stone, my chest is damn near touching the stone. But that position I'm looking for is I'm loading the hamstrings, so hips are way back. That also helps my knees get out of the way. A lot of people hit their knees while they deadlift the stone. If you have real long legs, that's gonna be probably your biggest problem in lifting stones, is hitting your knees. So my hips go way back, I go down, I finish, and while I do that squat, I go wide knees so it stays out of the way. That just helps me personally. And from there, I want to deadlift as high as I possibly can before I even think about lapping. You need to build that specific strength to deadlift and pull high. before you can even think about your lat position. So, for example, I will clear the knees before I even try to turn. Clear the knees, sit, okay? What I don't want to do is let it hit my knees and roll, which you can still get away with that, but as far as practicing technique, you're probably going to want to practice deadlifting higher. Same thing applies on sandbags and kegs and anything like that. You want to deadlift hard and deadlift high. Deadlift high, sit, there's my lap, okay? If I have really long legs and I have a problem with my knees hitting the stone, I've seen people they kind of do this side-to-side maneuver where they force the knees behind the stone or the sandbag during the deadlift. So that'll look something like this. They deadlift high, get a knee behind, and have to work the stone a little bit, and then they're in their lap, okay? So once you have your deadlift off the floor down, just note, you're gonna have, that is maybe a new position, so you're gonna have to build strength in that specific position. It's a really deep, basically wide stance, stiff leg deadlift. Maybe a little bit of bend in the knees depending on your leverages, but it is a new position. So you just need to do it more often. I find it easiest to do reps by practicing on sandbags as opposed to stones because you don't have to mess with tacky and all that. But you do need to build strength in that position. And then as we transition to the lap, we need to keep in mind that we're starting to set ourselves up for a squat pattern, not a crane pattern. So how I'm going to do that is I want to get a high contact point on the body with the stone. So a lot of people in the lap, they touch about here, they pull the stone in really tight, and then when they go to extend, they can only get to about here. I want a higher contact point on the upper part of my stomach so my brace can push into the stone, and when it comes down to it, I can extend higher. So how I'm going to do that, first step, is once I deadlift and I clear the knees, as I try to transition to the lap, I take a little bit of a step in. So if I go wide knees, and I go to the lap, okay, now the stone's in contact with my stomach, and I extend and I'm here, okay? But if I step in, now it's higher on my knees, I can sit lower, and now it's contact on my chest, and now I can do proper extension. So that little step in is key. Obviously, there's a point of diminishing returns. We're on such a narrow squat that it's just not going to be powerful, but staying out high with your knees on the outside of the stone is not going to be the way to set up for a good pattern. So a little step in before you go to the lap. The most common mistake I find in the lap position going into the extension is people are too much over top of the stone as opposed to being vertical behind the stone like a squat. So I'll show an example of both. So the bad position, people do this on logs, sandbags, stones, basically anything with a lap position. They will go like this, they will deadlift, lap. Now they're over the top and their hips are way back and their shoulders are way forward. And the only thing they can do is crane and trade positions, hips forward, shoulders back, and they do this, okay? And when your hips travel in front of the midline, there's no good way to use the glutes, and you go to the toes early, and you'll end up with an extension you're stuck right here. But if you do what I'm describing, you go vertical, behind the stone, okay? You squat full foot straight up, and you're good. So once you found your lap position, you can obviously tell with my leverages, I favor a squat pattern on basically everything. I also think that favoring a squat pattern influences how you set your hands on the stone. I really don't like that traditional 10 and 2 over the top where people do that because it results in that pattern that I don't like. This, okay? Real deadlift dominant athletes might prefer that, but I think that when the stones get really, really heavy, you're gonna have the same problems I've been describing where the hips shoot under, you go to the toes, and you have nothing left to lift with, and you're just kind of cranking on the stone like that. I don't think you should be right around the side. I think the sweet spot is somewhere between, here's like 10 and 3 on the clock, or 9 and 3 on the clock, and 10 and 2, somewhere in the middle, just above the middle of the stone, because I still want to get as much surface area as I can on the stone. But if I'm too high, all I can do is do this overarching crane as opposed to staying in a good brace stacked squat. And how I get that grip is the same way that I described off the floor, where I reach through the lats, I get contact with the hands, get contact with the forearms, and then I pull back through my back and pull that slack out of my forearms. So I actually find that the grip in the lap is easier as I get to bigger and bigger stones, so I can get closer to straight arms, out, and pull that way. And in this stage, I do have to do a lot of active squeezing to really hold onto a stone, especially when your tacky's failing. So I'll do an example. I don't like this crane position. You'll see the stone roll down like that, or they'll get to the top and they have just nothing left to do except go to the toes. Look at that, they can't go any higher. I go closer to 9 and 3, squat straight up, then I bring the hips, and I have the leverage to pull up high. All these positions set us up for what is the most important pattern in loading stones. I think it's the thing that people do poorly most often, is at the end of the day, it's just a squat. And at first, what I'm describing will feel impossible, but remember, strength is specific to positions, so you need to build strength in those specific positions over time. So think of it like a teeter-totter, okay? It's like a V, okay? The weight of the stone, the weight of me. If they're evenly balanced as I rise, we're gonna be balanced. If I bring my hips forward too soon, now we're doing this, and the stone's bringing us forward. If I'm sitting too far back, I'm gonna be on my heels, and I'm gonna feel like I'm gonna fall backwards. So what you need to do is keep the teeter-totter balanced as you rise through the squat. Easiest way to do that is think about keeping your hips back for just a bit longer as you squat. I wanna save my hips firing and going underneath the stone until I get all the way up to the top, and then I'll bring my toes. I don't wanna go to my toes early. The biggest cue you'll probably hear me yelling at athletes is full foot. I wanna stay in a full foot squat for even longer, okay? So if I keep my hips back, the weight of me is staying pretty even on this side of the teeter-totter. The weight of the stone is on that side of the teeter-totter. I rise almost all the way to locked out. Then I bring the glutes. But now, because the stone is lifted higher, this side of the teeter-totter came in, and now my hips went under, this side of the teeter-totter went in. So we're still in balance. But that hard extension up tall is specific strength that is gonna take time to build. But when you master that, you're gonna be able to load really, really high. I think the gold standard is being able to load to about top of your sternum height on a platform without your heels coming off the ground. So in practice, I'll do a few reps. Okay, so I keep my hips back, squat, full foot, then I bring the hips, okay? If I bring the hips early, okay, all I can do is rise to my toes, but my knees are soft, so I can't keep rising. So I wanna push, hard squat, then I bring the hips and toes and look up, and I pull through the T-spine up. Boom. Now it can be even better if I have a high contact point on my chest. High contact point. Now it's touching my chin. That's as high as I can go with my heels still down. Now I'll practice basically 90% of my stone training like I just did doing stone extensions. If I'm constantly focused on the feedback of loading to a platform, you can get away with a lot of things like going to your toes early, leaning early, not getting a full squat pattern. And if you're always focused on loading to platforms, you're gonna feel really successful, but when you have to load high or load heavy, you're gonna find that your pattern breaks down. So if 90% of your training is this kind of stuff, where your goal is to get as high as you can go, as possibly go, with your heels still down, when it comes down to a contest and you have to load to 48 inches, it's gonna be really easy. All these same things apply with a sandbag, with a keg. So if you're in a prep phase, maybe 12, 10, 8 weeks out from a show, Might not make sense to be running the full medley, but it's a great time to build specific strength in your extension. So practicing just an extension, like I just showed here on the platform, with a stone, sandbag, keg, it's probably a great use of your time. Hitting sets and reps, either pick from the floor, hit an extension, or just going from the lap to extension, lap to extension. You gotta build that specific strength, especially that top portion where I really extend tall and that teeter-totter comes together skinny. So hope this helps, guys. We're gonna keep doing these technique tips. This YouTube has been a lot of fun. We're gonna keep doing more, do more podcasts. Like, subscribe, share. I really enjoy nerding out on technique. So share these with your friends. Share it with your friend that sucks at stones, because I don't want him to suck at stones anymore. This was a tough event for me for a long time. It took a long time to learn this stuff. So any feedback is appreciated. And thank you guys for sticking with me as I breathe hard and show you guys how to do stones.